In fact, one of the things we've been talking about, if you're new to Aspire Church, for the last several weeks, we have been talking about this idea that God really does want us to know Him. He wants us to know His purposes, and He wants us to know His ways. And we've been doing this by looking at 7 realities. These are not 7 steps to knowing and doing the will of God. These are 7 realities, 7 truths that you can find throughout the Bible as you read Old and New Testament about how do we know God and how do we know what He's calling us to do. And if you are with us for the first time, we're really glad you are. And today, as we talk about a person who lived hundreds and thousands of years ago, and her stories in the Old Testament, her name is Esther. If you have a Bible, you can go ahead and start looking in your table of contents for the book of Esther that tells her story. We're going to actually review these realities in the story of Esther. Also, if you're first time with us, in your worship guide you were given as you came in, there's a fill in the blank spot, and we'll kind of review these 7 realities as we get into it. And you can also visit our website, aspirejax.org, if you want to catch up on any of these messages or if you missed any. But maybe more important than any of that, we have this devotion guide available. It's the 7 realities of experiencing God. If you are somebody who needs some guide to having a daily quiet time, this would be a great thing to do. We've got those available as you leave today. If you want to pick one of those up, it will just help you kind of walk through these realities through the story of Moses. So you can pick one of those up as you leave today. But let's just kind of recap where we've been before we get into Esther's story. The first thing we said about knowing and doing the will of God is that we have to understand that God is always at work around us. He is always at work around us. We see that in big ways, but also in small ways. We see it in beautiful ways, but we also know that in the tragedies and the difficulties of life, God is also at work. Not always easy to see, but it's always true. The second thing that we realized is that God is pursuing a continuing love relationship with you that is real and personal. That God is in pursuit of you. He wants you to know Him. He wants you to know His will. And so God is pursuing a continuing love relationship with you that's real and personal. The third thing that we've said is that God invites you to become involved with Him and His work. So we looked at this a couple weeks ago, how God is inviting us, like He's always at work around us, and He is inviting us to be involved with Him in that work. That relationship that God wants to have with us is part of God's way of pursuing us and of us knowing Him as we join Him in the work He's doing. And then last week, we looked at the idea that God speaks. And we said that God speaks today as much as He spoke in the Old Testament, as much as He spoke through Jesus in the New Testament, so God is speaking today. He speaks by the Holy Spirit through the Bible, prayer, circumstances in the church to reveal Himself, His purposes, and His ways. So today, if you've not been with us before, we are going to track all of these realities through the life of Esther. Now, let me set Esther up for you because this is an Old Testament story you may not be familiar with. This is actually one of those Old Testament books that scholars throughout the year have even questioned, should it be in the Bible? I think absolutely it is an inspired word of God, but this book doesn't necessarily have any overt, obvious miracles, right? I know sometimes if you're like me, I read the Bible and I read, a burning bush or a parting sea or all these miraculous things, and I'm like, I don't know if I can relate to that because bushes just don't catch on fire in my life usually. I mean, it's not that obvious for me. Well, if that's you, Esther's a great story for you because there's nothing, again, that's exactly that obvious, and yet we can still see all of these things, all these realities in Esther's life. So let me set her up for you. So there was a time in Jewish history where they had been carried off from their homeland in Israel into captivity into Babylon. And so there were generations of people who had lived as refugees in this foreign country, okay? They had been taken there and raised there, but there were some people who remember back when they lived in Israel, okay? So we're gonna meet in this story a man named Mordecai who was carried away from captivity into Babylon, and his young niece is a woman by the name of Esther. So if you have a Bible, look with me at Esther chapter 2. We'll begin in verse 7. But the first thing we see is that God was always at work around Esther. God was always at work around Esther. Now, before we get into her story, let me just also tell you about the king of Persia at this time. His name is King Xerxes, Emperor Xerxes. And he was not a good guy. He was a bad guy. He was an evil king. And the Jews are living in captivity, in exile, in this area where Xerxes is the king, okay? So Esther chapter 2, beginning at verse 5. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, that's the citadel or the capital where the king lives, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So that's just giving you the background. This guy, Mordecai, was carried off to captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, but now King Xerxes is in charge. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Hadassah and Esther are just the names that you know her. We're going to call her Esther for the rest of our time today. The daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Esther is an orphan, and her cousin, her older cousin, takes her in as his own and raises her as his ward. Now, meanwhile, back in the capital, King Xerxes decides that he's not satisfied with his wife, the queen, anymore. Queen Vashti has made him mad. She's not satisfying him. He has called her into this party where he wants her to show off for all his friends, and she refuses because he's drunk and they're all drunk and she won't go in. And so the king decides, you know what? You're not going to be queen anymore. I'm going to get a new queen. And so he decides that he is going to have a beauty pageant. We'll call it beauty pageant to keep it rated PG in here. He is going to have a beauty pageant where all the young, beautiful women in Susa are going to be brought into his harem and can audition to be the next queen, okay? So you're getting the idea here. So when you think about this story, you got to realize nothing is going good for Esther, because guess who gets scooped up and brought in to the harem of the king? Look with me at verse 8. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai is the man who's in charge of the harem, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of all the women. Now let me just track for you here from Esther's perspective, okay? Esther is a refugee. She's living in a foreign country. She is not in the majority. So she is already at a disadvantage. But then not only that, she is also somebody who has been orphaned. She has no parents. So she's living on the generosity of her cousin who is raising her. And now she is being trafficked, because that's exactly what this is about. That Esther is being trafficked along with all of these other women. They're being taken against their will, away from their families, and brought into the king's harem. Things are not looking good for Esther. And remember, what have we said? What's the principle we see here? That God is always at work around Esther. But if God is at work, it sure doesn't seem like he is working for Esther's well-being at this point. And this is one of the things that we have to understand, that God is always working even when things don't look so good. That God doesn't just work on the hills, on the hilltops, on the mountains like we just sang about. He's a God of the valleys too. He's a God who is working when we've been neglected, forsaken, abandoned, orphaned, that God is at work. Sometimes we just can't see it because we're so consumed with the pain of our own circumstance, that we're just so focused on what we're going through, we can't see it in the moment. But this is where Romans 8:28 comes into play, and this is a verse that we should never just use to dismiss somebody's pain, but it is so true that God, we know that God is working in all things. God is working good for all things for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't say that all things are good. It just said that we know that in all things God is working for the good of the people who love him and are called according to his purpose. And Esther loves God, and Esther is called according to his purpose, and God is working around Esther, even through these horrible situations and circumstances. In fact, we see the second reality at play here as well in Esther's life, that God was pursuing a continuing love relationship with Esther that was real and personal. Look with me at verse 9 of chapter 2. And the young woman pleased Haggai and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. In other words, Mordecai had told her when she was taken in, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. Don't tell anybody that you're one of us, okay? And every day, listen to this, every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Can you see God and how he's manifesting his love for Esther through the faithful presence of Mordecai. This man who took her in, probably as a young girl, who had raised her as his own daughter, and now even as she's been carried into this awful situation, guess who every day is walking by, just hoping to catch a glimpse of her? Who's sitting at the gate day and night, watching out for her, even though he has no power or no control. You see God's manifest love for Esther through Mordecai. And listen, I think sometimes that's how God manifests his love to us in the most obvious ways. That God puts people in our life, and we see through those people in our lives the manifest presence of God's love. That's why the church is called the body of Christ, because it should be a place where the love of God is manifest. When people who don't feel God's presence or don't recognize presence come into the midst of other believers, they should feel God's love for them through God's people. And that's exactly what Mordecai was doing. That God was pursuing a continuing love relationship with Esther through Mordecai. He was displaying his love for her always. That he is a father to the fatherless. And Mordecai stood in the gap and filled in that role. But we also see God's manifest love for Esther in another way. By granting her favor in the eyes of the man who was in charge of the king's harem. I mean, this is pretty spectacular. This guy who's in charge of this pagan guy who's in charge of the harem, somehow God turns his heart and he pays special attention to Esther and gives her all of these advantages. This is a tendency and a trend that you see throughout the Old Testament. In fact, if you remember the story of Joseph, Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers and carried down to Egypt, where a man named Potiphar bought him to be a slave in his house. And this is what it says in Genesis 39 verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight, that's Potiphar's sight, and made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And then things got worse for Joseph. Potiphar's wife accused him of rape. He was carried off and put into prison. But listen to how God was pursuing Joseph even in prison. Genesis 39 verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Also Daniel, when he was carried into captivity, Daniel chapter 1 verse 9, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. See, one of the ways that God is pursuing you and pursuing a continuing love relationship with you isn't just through the love he manifests through the people around you, but it's also at those times where it's unexplainable, but God is just showing you favor in the eyes of other people, even pagans, that God can turn their hearts. And that's what God's doing as he's pursuing this relationship with Esther. But next we see how God invites Esther to become involved with him and his work. So Mordecai had been faithfully sitting at the gate, day in and day out, every day sitting there. And while he's keeping watch over Esther, he hears about a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. Now, I'm sure that for many people in the nation, especially those who were in exile and held captive there, it would have been thought, well, all right, this guy's getting what's coming to him, right? But that's not what Haman thinks. Instead, Haman lets Esther know about it. Look what Esther chapter 2, verse 22 and 23. This came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So God is working. God is doing something. The only reason this Jewish man is sitting at the gates day in and day out is because this evil king has taken his ward captive into his harem, and he's sitting there. Meanwhile, God has him exactly where he needs to be to hear about this plot. And that's going to be an important thing that happens later. Meanwhile, King Xerxes, as evil as he is, he has an even more evil prime minister. And this guy's name is Haman, all right? Now, when you hear Haman, you're supposed to say, boo, all right? So let's practice it, all right? And he has a prime minister named Haman. All right, very good, very good. All right, that's just a tradition when it comes to the celebration of Purim. So Mordecai, and he's sitting at the gate every day, and this person named Haman is, good, very good. It's said that every time that he walks by, people are supposed to bow to him as if he were the king. But Mordecai refuses to do it. So look with me at Esther chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. So let me just summarize this. He is such a narcissist. He is such a power monger. He is so insecure. Not that any of you have ever met anybody like this, but if you could imagine somebody this narcissistic and power hungry, that when Mordecai doesn't bow to him, it's not good enough for Haman just to try to kill and punish Mordecai. He wants all the Jews to be killed. He wants all the Jews to be eradicated. So he goes back to the king, and the king, who's more interested in partying than he is in actually ruling, he convinces the king to sign an edict, and in the edict says basically there's a day coming when all the people of the kingdom can attack the Jews, can rob from them, can steal everything they have, and can kill them. So they're going to eradicate the Jews from among them. That's the plan. And Xerxes signs it, and Haman says, by the way, I'll pay for it. Like, I will cover the expense that if this law costs the kingdom any money, I'm going to pay for it. So meanwhile, Mordecai hears about this. And Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. In other words, in my family, we would call that your give up on the world pants, right? I mean, these are just, he's just wearing sweats. He is not combing his hair. He's not shaving. He's not doing anything. And every day, day by day, he's going to the temple or going to the palace gates, and he's sitting there looking out for Esther. And Esther's looking out the window, and she's seeing him, and she's worried about him. She's worried about what's going on. So Mordecai told him all that happened. This is the servant. Esther sends her servant down, say, hey, go check out and see what's going on with my cousin. So Mordecai told the servant all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written edict issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and listen to this, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. So you see what's going on. God has been at work through all of this. Through this exiled, orphaned, trafficked girl who is now in the palace with the king, and the Jews who are about to be eradicated through this narcissistic tyrant who has issued this decree, and Esther is the only person in the right place at just this time in order to respond. And here's where we come to the fifth reality in experiencing God. That God's invitation led Esther to a crisis of belief that required faith and action. That whenever God invites you to become involved with him and his work, it will always lead you to a crisis of faith that will require faith and action. Listen to what it says, Esther chapter 4, verse 11. Because this is Esther's response. Because remember, Mordecai has just said, I need you to go to the king and plead our case so that we don't get killed. And here's what Esther responds back. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that if any man or woman goes into the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So there's this rule that if you go into the king's court and he didn't invite you, off with your head. And the only exception would be if the king extends his scepter to you. And Esther is saying, he hasn't called me in 30 days. Now, she's the queen, but he's got a harem full of women. And somehow he's just moved on. He's forgotten about Esther. And Esther's saying, Mordecai, I am taking my life in my hands. If I do this thing for you, if I go in there and he doesn't extend his scepter to me, I'm dead. I'm risking my life. Now listen, what Esther chooses to do next will reveal what she believes about God. Esther's decision at this point has more to do with what she believes about God than it has to do with what she believes about herself. I mean, Esther knows how weak she is. She knows how vulnerable she is. What Esther does next has nothing to do with what she believes about her husband. She knows what a tyrant he is. She knows how evil he is. But what Esther chooses to do next will reveal what she actually believes about God. And her response was going to require her to have tremendous trust in God, but to also take that faith in God and turn it into action. Then Esther told them to, verse 13, Esther chapter 4, verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise up for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai, he basically says, I know you're taking your lives in your hands, but God has placed you here, Esther, at just such a time. Don't waste the tragedies. Don't waste the hurt. Don't waste the abuse. This is what God has been doing. When you couldn't see God in the valley, this is where God has been working. He has been moving you into this place for just such a time as this. And Esther, if you aren't obedient, my faith in God tells me that he will bring another deliverer. But you are here for just such a time as this. I believe this is the call that God has on every single person who follows Jesus. For just such a time as this. Right now, wherever you are in your school, whether you're on a middle school campus, high school campus, whether you're in college right now, in your workplace, in the neighborhood where God has placed you, with the people God has brought into your life, how do you know? How do you know that God hasn't placed you there for just such a time as this? Whatever influence God's given you, whatever authority God has entrusted to you. And that might be, you might think, I don't have any influence or any authority. But wherever you are, how do you know that God hasn't put you there for just such a time of this? The same God who's been working all around you, the same God who's pursuing a love relationship, the same guy who's inviting you to join him in what he's doing. And now you come to this crisis of belief that's going to require faith and action. Esther's response, we see this response in chapter 4, verse 15 through 17. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther ordered him to do. I love Esther's response. She doesn't just say okay and go in. She says, you know what, this is a big deal. We need to fast and pray to be sure this is God's will and this is God's way. She doesn't assume it. And remember what we learned last week, that God speaks by the Holy Spirit through the Bible, prayer, circumstances in the church to reveal himself, his purposes, and his ways. And here you see Esther depending on God, depending on prayer in this critical moment to be sure. She's got all of her people fasting and praying. She's got all of Mordecai's people fasting and praying. And ultimately, Esther is going to be obedient to what God has called her to do for just such a time as this. And the Jews end up being saved. And it was because Esther responded to her crisis of belief with faith and with action. Henry Blackaby says this, before I call myself, my family, or my church to exercise faith, I must be sure that I've heard a word from God. Esther wanted to be sure that she'd heard a word from God. I don't know about you, but I know that there are times in my life where I sometimes wonder, was that God calling me to do that? Is that God inviting me into that circumstance? How do you know? How do you know for sure that it's God who is the one who's inviting you? Let me just share a couple thoughts with you about how to know. First of all, I believe this. We have to look with our eyes open, and we have to prayerfully look at our circumstances. How is God already at work around you? And I don't just mean in the good things, in the way he's blessing you, but in the tragedies and the hardships. How is God working around you? And what has God been doing through the course of that activity around you? And how is he inviting you? One of the ways you'll know that it's God who's inviting you to join him is that it will be a God-sized task. When God invites you to do something, it will be a God-sized task. When God wants you to join him in his work, he is assigning you something that only he can do. When God lets you know what he wants to do through you, it will be something that only he can do. Because if you could do it in your own power, then you don't need God, and you can get all the glory and the credit for it. It will be a God-sized task. The second thing I think about when I look at, is this God calling me or not, is when God calls, when God invites, it always leads to a crisis of belief. Always. If what I'm sensing God is calling me to do doesn't require any faith on my part, it's probably not God. Because God is always calling me to join him in his work, and that will result in a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. My question for you and for us as a church, for you and your family, for us as a congregation, is this: where's our crisis of belief? What's your crisis of belief? Have you become so disconnected from God's activity in your life on a day-to-day basis that you're not even aware of the way God is working around you? Maybe your situation, like Esther's, is a desperate one. You've been abandoned, neglected, abused, and you've become so consumed with the pain and the hardship. And listen, I don't know your story. I can't imagine what you're going through. I'm not trying to diminish it or make light of it. I'm just saying that if you can't see God in the midst of that circumstance, it's going to be difficult for you to understand what God may be doing in the middle of it. And I know sometimes it's so dark you can't see anything, which is why you need other people in your life walking beside you through those dark valleys, manifesting God's presence in your life. You need a Mordecai sitting at the gate, faithfully praying for you. It's why community, why being a part of church is so critically important. But where's your crisis of belief? Where is God inviting you to join him in his work? And what crisis or what conflict is that creating in your own heart? Where you're having to determine, what do I believe about God in this moment? What do I believe about God in this circumstance? And am I willing to take the step of faith? Am I willing with Esther to say, if I perish, I perish. But I will not miss my such a time as this, because this is exactly where God has called me to be. You need to identify your crisis of belief. Henry Blackaby says this about our crisis of belief and our response. When God's people and the world see something only God can do, they know it is God. Let people see the difference the living Christ makes in a life, a family, or a church. That will make a difference in how they respond to the gospel. See, Esther's obedience not only saved the Jewish people living in that part of the world, but it became a witness for all of the people in that city. When they saw what God did, when they saw God's activity, there were people who didn't believe in God who came to believe in God for what they had seen through the Jewish people living in that city. There were people who became God worshipers as a result. The world is longing to see God-sized activity in our lives, in our families, and in God's church. I don't want to spend the rest of my life playing it safe. I mean, if Esther had played it safe, just think of what would have happened. Mordecai said there would have been another deliverer who would have come. But Esther, you and your family will perish. I don't want to play it safe. I don't want to just do what I know I can accomplish in my own power, because God will never be glorified through that kind of life. Our city doesn't need another church that succeeds because it has a great marketing strategy or the coolest building or the flashiest worship services. Our city needs to see a church participating in something that is God-sized. They need to see God at work in you. Your school needs to see God at work in you, students. Guys, women who are working in businesses, owning businesses, people need to see God at work in you. We have to be willing, though, to recognize where is he working and how can I join him? And it is going to lead you to a crisis of belief. And what you do in that crisis will reveal more about what you believe about God than anything you say. See, we can all say we believe in God. We can all say, yeah, I follow Jesus. I'm a Jesus follower. One of the things I love about baptism is it requires faith and action, right? I mean, it's I believe, but it's also I'm going to take this action. I'm going to take the plunge literally. Listen, don't let the only action you've taken as a result of your faith be your baptism. You should live every day so that your faith is driving you to an action, and God is getting glorified through it and through you and through his church as he does what only he can do in and through lives who are fully yielded and surrendered to him. God has taken you somewhere. He's got you someplace right now for such a time as this. Will you respond?